The elite U.S. Army Rangers burst into laughter when they saw the old veterans' survival techniques. "That's not how we do things now, old man. We have GPS, satellite comms, and MRES." But when their helicopter went down in the Alaska wilderness and all their high-tech equipment failed, the 72-year-old Vietnam veteran became their only hope of survival for 7 grueling days. Captain Derek Stone, 29 years old and leader of the 3rd Ranger Battalion's most elite survival training unit, prided himself on utilizing the latest in military survival technology. His team carried satellite phones, GPS devices, emergency beacons, water purification tablets, and enough high-tech gear to survive anything the wilderness could throw at them. He looked down on what he called old-school bushcraft as outdated and inefficient. The Monday morning survival training exercise in the Alaskan wilderness was supposed to be routine when 72-year-old Raymond Bear McKenzie was introduced as a civilian survival consultant. Bear looked like he had stepped out of a 1970s wilderness magazine. Worn leather boots, faded military surplus jacket, and a simple canvas pack that appeared to contain nothing more sophisticated than rope and a knife. Bear moved with the deliberate care of age, but his eyes constantly scanned the environment with the awareness of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of nature. He wore no modern gear, carried no electronic devices, and seemed to rely entirely on what Stone's Rangers considered primitive methods. "Gentlemen," the training coordinator announced, "Mr. McKenzie will be accompanying your unit as an observer and consultant during this week's survival exercise." But what he didn't know yet. Captain Stone looked at Bear with barely concealed disdain. The old man's equipment looked like something from a Boy Scout handbook, not suitable for serious military survival training. "Sir," Stone addressed Bear with forced politeness, "I hope you can keep up. We move fast and use advanced techniques that might be different from whatever you learned back in your day." Bear looked at the young ranger with patient eyes. "I'll do my best to stay out of your way, Captain." Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, Stone's second-in-command, gestured at Bear's simple pack. "What's in there, sir?" "No GPS, no satellite phone, no emergency beacon?" "Just the basics, Sergeant. Knife, rope, some cordage, same things I carried in Vietnam." The 6 Rangers exchanged glances and suppressed smirks. Vietnam was ancient history to them. They had trained with the most advanced survival technology available and couldn't imagine depending on such primitive equipment. "Vietnam?" Sergeant First Class Tyler Brooks couldn't hide his amusement. "Sir, survival techniques have evolved considerably since then. We don't need to rub sticks together anymore." "That's not how we do things now, old man," added Specialist Mike Davis, the team's communications expert. "We have GPS, satellite comms, and MRES. Why make things harder than they need to be?" The other Rangers chuckled, clearly viewing Bear as a relic who would struggle to keep up with their modern, efficient approach to wilderness survival. That's when everything changed. The team boarded their UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter for insertion into the remote Alaskan wilderness. The plan was simple: spend 5 days in the field using their advanced survival skills and equipment, then extract at a predetermined location. Bear sat quietly in the helicopter, watching the Rangers check their high-tech gear one final time. GPS units, satellite communicators, water purification systems, portable shelters, and enough technology to stay connected to civilization even in the most remote locations. "Pretty different from your day, huh?" Captain Stone shouted over the helicopter noise, pointing at their equipment arrays. "No more getting lost or going hungry with gear like this." Bear nodded politely, but said nothing, his attention focused on the terrain passing below them. The helicopter was flying through a mountain pass, when the weather suddenly deteriorated. What had been clear skies turned into a violent storm system with zero visibility and dangerous crosswinds. "We need to set down immediately," the pilot announced over the intercom. This storm came out of nowhere. The pilot attempted an emergency landing in what appeared to be a small clearing, but the helicopter struck a hidden tree stump during touchdown. The impact was violent. The aircraft rolled twice before coming to rest on its side. The biggest shock was still coming. When the Rangers regained consciousness, they found themselves in a nightmare scenario. The helicopter was badly damaged, the pilot was seriously injured, and their carefully planned survival exercise had become a real fight for survival. Worse yet, the crash had destroyed most of their high-tech equipment. GPS units were shattered, satellite phones were dead, emergency beacons were crushed, and their supplies were scattered across the crash site. "What's our position?" Captain Stone demanded, trying to get his bearings. Sergeant Johnson checked his backup GPS device. "Dead, sir. All electronic navigation is down." "Satellite phone?" "Negative. Impact destroyed the antenna array." "Emergency beacon?" Specialist Davis held up the crushed remains. "Total loss, sir." Stone looked around at the wreckage, his confidence shaken. They were alone in the Alaskan wilderness with an injured pilot, no way to communicate, no idea of their exact location, and rapidly deteriorating weather. But wait, there's more. Bear had also been thrown around in the crash, but he was already moving with purpose, assessing their situation with the calm, methodical approach of someone who had faced desperate circumstances before. "Captain," Bear said quietly, "we need to focus on immediate priorities: shelter, warmth, and treating the injured." Stone was too shocked by their predicament to argue. "What do you suggest?" Bear was already gathering materials from the wreckage. "First, we need to stabilize the pilot and get him warm. Then we need to build a shelter before this storm gets worse." The Rangers watched in growing amazement as Bear began constructing what appeared to be a sophisticated survival shelter using nothing but debris from the helicopter, natural materials, and techniques that seemed to come from decades of experience. "How do you know how to do this?" Sergeant Brooks asked, genuinely curious for the first time. 72 days behind enemy lines in Vietnam," Bear replied simply, continuing his work. "You learn fast when your life depends on it." Stone realized that their survival might depend entirely on the primitive skills he had mocked just hours earlier. What happened next surprised everyone. As the storm intensified, Bear's improvised shelter proved to be remarkably effective. Using a combination of helicopter parts, salvaged materials, and natural insulation techniques, he had created a space that kept the team warm and dry while the storm raged outside. "How did you know to angle it like that?" Johnson asked, genuinely impressed by the shelter's design. "Wind patterns," Bear explained patiently. "You read the terrain, watch how the trees bend, feel where the cold air flows. Takes time to learn, but it's more reliable than any weather app." The pilot, though injured, was stable and warm thanks to Bear's immediate first aid using improvised materials and field medicine techniques that weren't taught in any modern manual. On the second day, their food situation became critical. The Rangers' MREs had been scattered, and many were damaged in the crash. "We've got maybe 2 days of rations left," Stone announced grimly. Bear had been quietly observing the local environment. "There's food here, Captain. You just have to know where to look." Over the next several hours, Bear demonstrated skills that the Rangers had never seen before. He identified edible plants, set snares for small game, and located clean water sources using techniques that seemed almost mystical to the technology-dependent soldiers. If stories of survival, ancient skills, and the wisdom that can mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness inspire you, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful reminders that some knowledge can't be replaced by technology, and that the most important survival tool is often the one between your ears. Hit that subscribe button to witness more incredible stories of those who mastered skills that could save lives. The real surprise was, by the third day, the Rangers' respect for Bear had transformed from polite tolerance to genuine awe. While they had been trained to rely on equipment, Bear demonstrated that true survival skills came from understanding the environment itself. "Mr. Mackenzie," Captain Stone said, using Bear's name with respect for the first time, "I need to ask you something. How many times have you been in situations like this?" Bear was working on a fish trap he had constructed from helicopter debris and natural materials. "More times than I care to remember, Captain. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Sometimes the equipment fails, the extraction doesn't come, or the mission goes sideways. When that happens, you survive with what you know, not what you carry." Sergeant Johnson watched Bear's hands work with practiced efficiency. "What you're doing, this isn't in any survival manual I've ever read. Son, real survival skills aren't in manuals. They're learned by necessity, practiced in desperation, and passed down by those who lived through it." On the fourth day, the Rangers' electronic equipment remained dead. But Bear had established a sustainable survival routine. Fresh water from a spring he had located, fish from traps he had built, edible plants he had identified, and a camp that remained warm and dry despite the harsh conditions. That's when the phone rang. Actually, nothing rang. That was the problem. The Rangers realized they had been completely cut off from civilization for 4 days, with no way to call for help. Their families would be worried, search and rescue would be looking for them, but the crash site was well off their planned route. "We need to signal for help," Stone said, stating the obvious. Bear had been thinking about this problem since day one. "I've been working on something, Captain. Give me a few more hours." Using techniques that seemed to come from another era, Bear constructed a series of signal fires positioned to be visible from the air. He had calculated the optimal locations based on wind patterns, terrain features, and the likely search paths of rescue aircraft. "How do you know where to put them?" Davis asked, watching Bear position the signal materials. "You think like the pilot looking for you," Bear explained. "Where would you fly? What would catch your eye? How would you distinguish a signal from natural features?" Everyone learned the truth, but the real shock. On the 5th day, Bear's signal fires worked. A search and rescue helicopter spotted the smoke and located their crash site. But the rescue operation would take 2 more days due to weather conditions and the remote location. During those final 2 days, the Rangers learned more about survival from Bear than they had in years of military training. He taught them to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to find direction using natural indicators, to locate resources using signs invisible to untrained eyes. "Mr. Mackenzie," Sergeant Brooks asked on their final night, "why didn't you say anything when we were mocking your methods?" Bear was tending their fire with the same methodical care he applied to everything. "Son, some lessons can't be taught. They have to be learned through experience. You needed to understand that all your technology is just tools, useful when they work, useless when they don't." Captain Stone, who had started the week with complete confidence in his modern training, now understood the limitations of depending entirely on equipment. What happens when the GPS satellite goes down? When the battery dies? When the equipment breaks? Bear asked the group. That's when you find out if you're a survivor or just someone who knows how to operate devices. That's when the phone rang. On the morning of the 7th day, the rescue helicopter finally reached their location. The Rangers were evacuated safely. The injured pilot received proper medical care, and the entire team was debriefed on their survival experience. But the most important debriefing came from Bear himself. "Gentlemen," he told the assembled Rangers before they parted ways, "I want you to remember something. Technology is a multiplier, not a replacement. It can make a skilled person more effective, but it can't make an unskilled person skilled. The difference between survival and death isn't in your equipment. It's in your knowledge, your adaptability, and your will to live." Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the Ranger Training Program, had flown in personally to assess what had happened during the failed training exercise. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, "I understand you kept my Rangers alive for 7 days, using what they called primitive techniques." "Ma'am, there's nothing primitive about skills that work. Your Rangers are excellent soldiers, but they had been trained to depend on equipment rather than understanding. That's a dangerous weakness." The transformation that followed would become legendary in Ranger training. Word of Bear's performance during the 7-day survival ordeal spread throughout the Army Special Operations community. Videos and reports of his techniques became required study material for all survival training programs. Colonel Hayes immediately hired Bear as a permanent civilian instructor for the Ranger School Survival Program, revolutionizing their curriculum to include traditional skills alongside modern technology. Captain Stone and his team became Bear's most dedicated students, learning that the most advanced survival system was the one that worked when everything else failed. The Ranger Training Program instituted a new requirement. All candidates had to demonstrate the ability to survive for 72 hours using only primitive techniques. No electronics, no modern equipment, just knowledge and improvisation. Most importantly, Bear's experience became the foundation for a new training philosophy. Technology should enhance human capability, not replace it. Stone kept a photo on his desk from their rescue day, showing Bear calmly tending their signal fire while sophisticated rescue helicopters circled overhead. It served as a reminder that the most important survival tool was the knowledge carried in a trained mind. The canvas pack and simple knife that had been mocked as outdated became symbols of self-reliance and true preparation throughout the Ranger community. Years later, when Stone became a survival instructor himself, he would tell new Rangers about the weak and elderly Vietnam veteran had taught them that the most advanced survival technology in the world was worthless without the wisdom to use it properly. Bear continued to teach at the Ranger School, passing on skills that had kept him alive through decades of extreme situations. His lessons went far beyond wilderness survival. He taught adaptability, resourcefulness, and the mental toughness required to survive when everything goes wrong. The storm that had forced their helicopter down became known as Bear's Storm among Rangers who trained there, and every student learned about the man who had proved that some skills could never become obsolete because they were based on understanding rather than equipment. And every time a new class of Rangers expressed confidence in their high-tech gear, instructors would remind them of the 7 days when all their technology failed, and an elderly veteran with a knife and rope became the difference between survival and disaster. Sometimes the most important knowledge is the kind that doesn't require batteries, satellites, or software updates, just the wisdom that comes from experience and the humility to learn from those who survived when survival seemed impossible.